An Introduction to Environmental Anthropology. This lecture is meant to be a kind of preliminary description of environmental anthropology. And I'm going to do the description and the introduction, and I'm going to do the introduction and description through a case study from the People's Republic of China. So generally speaking, environmental anthropologists view humans in their environment, their habitat, their ecological niche. And we understand that environment is providing requirements for life. And so in environmental anthropology, human behavior, particularly learned behavior, not given by instinct, not simply what is innate, at the population level, is going to influence and is influenced by the environment itself. Since humans are an animal, their behavior is how they are adapting to the natural world. The modern world has seen a significant shift both in human behavior on the one hand and its relationship to the environment. Things like technology, right? Technological advances, things like urbanization, things like environmental governance, as well as environmental problems and global warming. All of this is important for environmental anthropologists. So our case study is on Altai, Kazakh. So Altai is a mountainous region of northwest China. It's considered to be part of the broader geographical region of southern Siberia and the Central Asian steppe. Some people refer to it as Inner Asia. And the Kazakh cultural group are an ethnic group. They're a Turkic-speaking ethnic group. And so environmental anthropologists are interested in things like human biology, the biosphere, the biological realm, learned behavior like culture, and its relationship to the environment. And when we're thinking about Altai Kazakh, there's a few things that we should add. For environmental anthropologists, they're going to be interested in their semi-subsistence nomadic pastoralism. That is how they subsist, right, within that particular environment. So nomadic pastoralism, but it's not just simply this kind of mechanistic subsistence strategy that is of interest, because that strategy is also made possible by the relationships between people. That subsistence strategy is also made possible by the worldview of people. In the context of Kazakh, they are Muslims. Their religion is Islam. And so Kazakh are herders. They herd sheep, goats, cattle, horses, and camels for meat, milk, and other materials. They're semi-subsistence. That means that part of their subsistence strategy and economy provides them with their basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. And then they are semi-subsistence in the terms of they produce more than they need, and they do trade on the market and obtain things for their needs on the market. As nomadic pastoralists, they move through an area of approximately 300 kilometers of pasturage. They have summer pastures that are in the very highest region of the Altai Mountains. For this particular group, this is the boundary between the People's Republic of China and Mongolia, Russia, and Kazakhstan, those highland Altai mountain pastures. And then they have winter pastures that are in the lowest altitude beyond the foothills of the Altai in the western Gobi, or for this particular region, it's known as the Gorbantungut Desert. So it's a huge elevation drop down to their winter pastures at about 12,000 feet. And so they're making a yearly migration from their highland summer pastures down into their lowland winter pastures. And as you can imagine, they have a great indigenous knowledge about things like pasture, vegetation, and management. Through things like archaeology, we know that there have been nomadic pastoralists in this region for many millennia. So there's a long continuity that has allowed people to develop very rich indigenous knowledge about the local environment. So if we're thinking about theories, so beyond just simply description, environmental anthropologists theorize. They try to explain what they see when they do research. And so two of the important kind of foundational theories would be known as cultural ecology and political ecology. And both of these theories are interested in the ecological determinants of how people subsist, how they relate to one another, and the power relations between them, and their worldviews broadly. So for Kazakh pastoralism, we're talking about the use of an area that without particular technologies and knowledges is not amenable to agriculture. There's not enough precipitation, there is not enough groundwater. And so Kazakh pastoralism is this kind of adaptation, really, to the aridness of these grasslands. And their knowledge, their learned behavior, their culture allows them to convert these drylands to useful subsistence materials like food and shelter. And they don't need the kind of inputs, external inputs, that you would think of for agriculture broadly. As we mentioned, there's an extensive knowledge of native plants that comes out of this as an adaptation. In research such as my own, I've seen that villagers can generally have general knowledge of about 100 native plants in their general region. They have a distinctive form of livestock that has also adapted to these environmental conditions. They raise what are known as Altai fat-tail sheep, and they have a tail that stores fat that allows them to adapt and manage the harsh conditions of winter when forage grasses are much less plentiful and less nutritious. So they have evolved in relationship to these distinctive breed and genetics of fat-tailed sheep. And generally, they're helping to maintain this large open range of northwest China that's known as grassland region. And this open habitat is rich with wildlife. So things like the Asian gazelle, for example, bear populations, and so on. Finally, if we're thinking about this ecological determinant of their learned behavior, we can think about how they manage land. So how they actually conduct their migrations, how they utilize different pastures by households and group of households. Traditionally, this would have been managed by tribal leadership. So in the non-modern period, it would have been done by tribal leaders, and that is part of the kin social organization, and it is patrilineal, so these are male tribal leaders. But in the modern period, that has been replaced by state bureaucracy. So as people will tell you, they no longer have the ability to determine a lot of their migration routes and a lot of their grazing regimes, that has been taken over by the state. This would be a good example, right, of the way that this kind of political relationship of state and local communities is determined to some extent, right, by the nature of the environment. I mentioned the notion of kind of modern changes as what's happened in the modern period, and environmental anthropologists are very interested in the way that what we call environmental modernity is impacting people's relationships to the environment. And it's kind of thinking about ecological or environmental determinants in a very different way for learned behavior. So we can talk about the way the state has invoked modern reforms of the region, of the local economy of the region, national reforms, integrating the region into a national market, orienting the local economy for productivity, for global market reforms in the People's Republic of China, so that increasingly, for example, the state is emphasizing cashmere production and the shift away from traditional forms of sheep to imported breeds of cashmere goats. Environmental modernity also includes the development of things like grassland science and the state bureaucracy that manages grassland based on scientific approaches, the development policy of industrializing their animal husbandry to have them better meet the needs of things like global textile markets for cashmere, and then at the same time, the state's invocation of conservation initiatives. So here you see in the photograph a sign for a new conservation region that overlaps Kazakh herders' traditional pasturage. And so the government right now is trying to really end nomadic pastoralism, is trying to settle the nomadic population. It is trying to protect the highland pasture areas as well as those lowland pasture areas, desert pasture areas in the winter. Some areas have seen limits or limitations on grazing. Other places have had outright grazing bans. And we see things like international species reintroduction. So researchers such as myself have been involved with international species reintroduction, things like the Przewalski's horses into pastoralist traditional pastures areas, into winter areas specifically for the Przewalski's horses, and then grazing bans to prevent and eliminate the interaction of herders' domestic horses with this unique species of Przewalski's horses. Of course, environmental anthropologists, because of this environmental modernity of the changing relationship between humans and the environment, they're very interested in things like global warming. And so in Altai, Kazakh are experiencing things like glacial retreat and permafrost thaw, leads to tremendous transformation of highland pastures. It leads to the increase of rodents that can access subterranean burrowing and so on in a terrain that lacks permafrost. And all residents have noted declines in rainfall. They've noted endangerment of certain plant species. They've noticed the extinction of some plant species. One, for example, that comes to mind, Woronat, an amazing plant that has photoluminescent properties. It lights up, and you can see this at night. I saw one during my own period of research and is known to be fairly extinct today, exceedingly uncommon and highly endangered. There has been clear observations of the expansion of toxic plants into pasturage. We see things under this global warming happening in terms of the way of life of Kazakh herders. So a traditional staple, something like sheep's milk, that was made into a beverage, that was made into butters and cheeses, are no longer made. That simply the pasture does not support sheep to produce enough milk. And this, of course, has impacts, right, on production, on calving, and so on. And this is also pushing not only, let's say, the state initiatives, but also the push for the dependence on goats, who can often sometimes palletize toxic plants. They can use increasingly marginal areas where grass is being produced less. They can consume roots. They actually, unlike sheep, they will dig at the plant's roots. And they're becoming more important for herders because of the way that they are adapting, right? Both on the one hand to environmental conditions, but also to the environmental modernity that we talked about, such as state policies. People do talk about degradation and erosion. It is localized, so it's only particular areas. Local herders wouldn't talk about the Altai region generally as degraded or eroded, but we can talk about certain pastures, right, that have seen larger livestock population numbers, and then things like, as you see in the image here, erosion. Finally, environmental anthropologists are scientists, they're humanists, and they are researchers. But increasingly, as global warming becomes a larger and more significant problem, and the implications of global warming become more and more clear for populations such as the Kazakh, we're interested in policy and advocacy. We're interested in what the future is, right, going to hold for humanity. And for Kazakh populations, in fact, there are many problems. We're seeing rapid reduction in mobility, which is an inherent part of the adaptation of Kazakh to arid, non-stable kinds of landscapes. And so they're increasingly being sedentarized and located in specific localities, precisely where we see areas of degradation and erosion. And so we're moving away from a purely nomadic pastoralism to transhuman, to agro-pastoral animal husbandry, where there may be natural pastures that are used around villages, but increasingly they are corral raised or enclosure raised, and they are provided with various kinds of feed, from feed purchased on the market like corn to hay that is collected from more distant pastures and is brought by horse and cart. Mentioned this idea of localized overgrazing and soil erosion, and increasingly we can talk about simply the decline of communities, the recognition of problems in sustaining this way of life, the increasing interest of Kazakh people to have their children be involved with off-farm employment, and the recognition that their culture is undergoing rapid change at present. In conclusion, we've been talking about environmental anthropology, right? And the idea of anthropological ecologies, right? The intermeshed, rather than thinking about the environment or ecology as something non-human, the enmeshed nature, right, of humans and the environment, the inseparable relationships between them. This is kind of the centerpiece of environmental anthropology. And big pressing issues is this notion of environmental modernism, the increasing use of science and conservation in managing the environment, and the political implications of those processes. Finally, we talked about the rise of the problem of global warming, really in the future of humanity.